Welcome to Stories of the Wanderer, a calming sleep story series created to help you unwind and gently drift into rest. Tonight we enter the second chapter of Where the Sky Rests, the Stone Path. In this chapter, the wanderer follows a quiet path around the observatory at dawn, where hidden stone markers, still water, and reflections of sky and earth reveal a larger pattern patiently waiting to be noticed. The first softness of morning had not yet turned into day, and the last stars still lingered faintly against the observatory's glass. In that gentle interval between one kind of quiet and another, which is when night begins to loosen its hold, but has not yet vanished completely, the observatory stood calm and hushed. In the half-light, the world started to reveal its shape slowly, as if each stone, each pane, each narrow blade of grass was remembering how to be seen. At that moment, the wanderer was already outside. He stood by the sheltered side of the copper doorway, where the wall curved inward and held a little of the warmth gathered through the long, dark hours. Behind him, the glass panel still mirrored a scattering of fading stars. Before him, the volcanic ground stretched out in muted colors. Black stone softened by ash, brown ridges tinged with gray, rust-red seams where old heat had once changed the rock and left a memory behind. The crater's rim curved away in a wide, patient line. It neither beckoned him forward nor urged him back. It simply remained broad and ancient, while cool air flowed over it and the warmth from below rose through hidden channels in the earth. The wanderer took a deep breath. The air held the thin clarity of a high place, tasting faintly of mineral dust, cold mist, and the dry scent of weathered stone. Beneath that crisp chill was a softer warmth from the mountain itself, not strong enough to be called smoke, not sharp enough to be called fire, but steady enough to be felt through his body. It radiated up through the soles of his boots and through the quiet spaces between stones, making the cold easier to bear and the morning seem more tender. He turned to look back at the observatory. In the pale half-light, the structure appeared as if it had grown naturally from the rim itself. Its lower walls were heavy stone, dark and close-fitted, blending with the rock around them. Above, weathered copper ribs arched upward, green in sheltered creases and dull gold where open air had polished them. The glass panes were dim now, holding onto the last few stars even as they welcomed the first diluted light from the horizon. The building seemed to be gently remembering the night while preparing to receive the day. The small symbol he discovered in the copper seam remained quietly in his thoughts, warm and glowing in memory. He hadn't rushed to examine it again upon waking. Instead, he left it where it was, half hidden and patient in its seam, sensing that some discoveries prefer not to be handled too often. They ask instead to be carried lightly, like a small ember cupped inside thought, a shallow curve beneath a single point, a low horizon holding a star, a bowl receiving a drop of light. Now, outside the observatory, that same image seemed to echo in the landscape shapes. The crater's rim formed a soft curve. The sky held a single fading point of brightness above it. The ground, still warm beneath the lingering cold, received the morning without haste. The wanderer smiled gently at the resemblance, then released it. It was enough just to notice. He didn't need to decide what it meant. At his feet, mosses clung to the sheltered side of a black rock, staying low and close to the stone. They were deep green where mist had collected, and paler at the edges where ash had dried them. Across the surrounding rock, lichen spread in soft, irregular patterns of silver, green, and muted yellow, like maps of small countries no one needed to name. Between them, fine grey grains of ash lay in hollows and cracks, gathering wherever the wind had briefly forgotten them. Further along the path, hardy grasses grew in loose tufts, their slender leaves bending together in the light wind. They didn't sway dramatically. Instead, they leaned, paused, then leaned again, as if listening to a slow breath moving across the crater. A few alpine plants pressed their small leaves flat against the ground, and near some darker stones, a handful of silvery shrubs grew low and rounded, their thick leaves turned upward to catch whatever warmth the morning might offer. Everything here seemed to have learned the wisdom of staying close to what supported it. The wanderer began walking. He followed a path that curved alongside the observatory, a safer, more settled track at a respectful distance from the crater's inner edge. The path wasn't straight. It bent around old stones, dipped where ash had collected, rose gently over ridges of dark rock, and narrowed where grasses leaned inward. It had the character of a route shaped by repeated, careful footsteps rather than by design, a way made by those who knew the mountain and never hurried across it. As he walked, the observatory slowly shifted in perspective behind him. At first, it was a shelter at his back, then a curved silhouette at his side. When he turned his head again, he saw it framed in pale morning light and copper lines, appearing smaller with each step, yet still quietly present. Its glass caught glints of early brightness. For a moment, he recalled the arc of reflected stars from last night, how it appeared only from the right spot, how it faded when he came too close, how it led him to the symbol hidden in the metal seam. He wondered if the world outside might also hold such patient alignments, quietly waiting to be seen. That thought arrived gently, and he followed it in the same gentle way. Soon the path widened by a low outcrop, where lichen coated the rock like old frost. There, half buried in ash, stood a stone that seemed different from the rest. It rose no taller than his boot, and bore no obvious carving, yet its upright shape seemed too deliberate to be accidental. The stones around it were scattered randomly, tilted by weather and time. This one, however, stood settled with its broad side facing the observatory. The wanderer halted. He crouched and gently swept away some ash with his sleeve. The stone was dark, porous, and unexpectedly light, a piece of volcanic rock riddled with tiny hollows. Pale lichen had begun to creep along one side. On its flat top was a shallow cup, where a bead of mist had gathered, trembling without spilling. He glanced back toward the observatory. From here, one of its glass panels caught a faint reflection of the brightening sky, framed by copper ribs at an angle he wouldn't have noticed from the doorway. Nothing obvious revealed itself yet, but the stone and the observatory seemed quietly connected by their positions alone. One low and rough on the ground, the other tall in copper and glass, both turned toward the same slowly brightening air. The wanderer stood and continued onward. A few steps further, another stone marker appeared at the path's edge. This one was paler and dusted with ash pressed into its surface. Fine grasses grew around its base. It leaned slightly toward the crater, and when the wanderer positioned himself beside it, he could still see the first stone behind him, and beyond that, the observatory. The two stones didn't lie in a straight line. They were arranged along a gentle curve. A quiet curiosity formed more clearly within him now. Even so, it remained soft and without urgency. It felt like a gathering of delicate threads, each easily released if one's mind grew tired. He kept walking with the same unhurried steps, letting his eyes drift over the ground without searching too intently. Morning gradually unfolded by small degrees. Over the rim, the sky's hue lightened from deep blue to a clear silver blue. The last stars faded without fanfare, leaving only the memory of where they had been. Mist lingered in low hollows among the rocks, and above warmer ground it rose in thin veils that dissipated as they climbed. The crater's subtle breath showed itself only in these delicate signs. The faint quiver of air above certain stones, the way the cold was just a bit less complete near darker vents and cracks. The wanderer passed a patch of moss thick enough to hold dew like tiny glass beads. Each droplet mirrored the pale sky, and a few captured the dark curve of the observatory in miniature. He paused, and the stillness of those reflections reminded him of the night before. Sky and glass, sky and metal, sky and water yet to be discovered. This place repeated the world back to him in its surfaces, not perfectly, but faithfully. Beyond the moss, the path drifted even farther from the building. Here, the wind had more space. It swept over the open slope in a soft, continuous hush, pushing the grasses one way, then relenting, then pressing them again. The wanderer pulled his cloak a little tighter around himself. He didn't mind the chill. The cold air kept his senses alert and clear. It sharpened the outline of each stone and made the warmth beneath them feel even more intimate by contrast. He noticed a slight movement near a cluster of grass and stopped calmly. A highland hare, its fur pale brown and grey, lifted its head from behind a rock. It then slipped between two stones and settled beside another tuft of grass, its mottled coat blending almost perfectly with the earth around it. For a quiet moment, the animal's complete stillness seemed part of the morning itself, a small life shaped for listening, staying warm, remaining concealed, and waiting patiently. The wanderer resumed walking. The subtle markers continued to appear along his route. Not many, and not in an obvious row, but once he had noticed them. He kept finding them at intervals. A dark upright stone by a grassy hollow, a light-coloured stone half covered in lichen, a flat stone with a shallow dip where mist collected, another nestled near a silvery shrub whose leaves held the first hint of warmth. Each was different, yet each was placed with similar humility, low enough not to demand attention, solid enough to endure all weather. He soon realized the path was curving to circle around the observatory. It wasn't leading away to some far slope after all. Instead, it traced a gentle arc around the building at a careful distance, an outer boundary drawn between the human shelter and the living mountain. The stones quietly marked that curve, each one a subtle reassurance that others had walked here before and chosen their steps deliberately. This discovery stirred something in him. Last night, the reflected stars inside the observatory had formed an arc of light that one could only see with patience and the right angle. Now, in the cool morning, these stones seemed to form another arc outside, grounded and rough, softened by ash and lichen and weather. One arc made of light, one arc made of earth, both incomplete when viewed from any single place, both gently inviting him to follow. He didn't yet know if this resemblance was intentional, but he felt a quiet pleasure at the pattern beginning to emerge. He continued along that boundary path. Sometimes it drew in closer to the observatory, letting him see the copper seams up close, green with age, streaked faintly from rain and dew, with ash gathered in the lower ledges. Other times it drifted farther away, and the building stood alone under the wide sky, a bowl of glass and copper perched on the black stone rim. To his left, the crater's rim remained broad and shadowy, warm beneath the morning chill. The ground underfoot gradually changed as he walked. In one stretch, the rocks were smooth and dark, polished by wind until they gleamed faintly. In another, the stone was rough and porous, trapping ash in its tiny hollows. In some patches, the soil, if it could be called soil at all, was red-brown and gritty, held together by root threads so fine they were like hair. Small alpine flowers grew there, not in abundance but sparingly, each offering a tiny pale face close to the earth, the petals no larger than flakes of shell. He slowed to admire these delicate blooms. Their presence felt almost impossible here, and yet they were not fragile in the way one might think. They were spare, careful, and perfectly suited. Their stems bent without breaking. Their leaves hugged close to any warmth. Their roots anchored firmly where there was little to hold on to. They offered no resistance to the wind. They survived by listening to it. A bird glided high overhead, silent against the brightening sky. It traced a wide, easy arc with wings held steady, looking as though it was carried more by the morning air than by its own effort. The wanderer watched until it became a small speck, then vanished entirely into the silver light. The day was growing a bit clearer now, not bright yet, but more defined. Shadows shrank back into deeper crevices. The observatory's glass freed itself of the last star reflections and began to mirror the slope, the sky, and the wanderer as a distant moving shape along the path. Occasionally, he glanced back and saw himself as faint fragments across the panes, a quiet double of him drifting through the glass while he walked outside. The stones guided him onward, their sequence built so gradually that it felt more like being accompanied than being led. Whenever he started to wonder if the pattern had ended, another marker would appear, continuing the curve and inviting another step. He noticed that the stones were not on the most prominent points where they would easily catch the eye, but in sheltered spots where they could last through the elements, tucked beside wind-smoothed boulders, near roots, against natural ridges of rock. They had been placed, not for show, but for permanence. This too felt akin to the observatory's character. Purpose without proclamation. Care without insistence. On the far side of the building, the path dipped into a shallow hollow where the air changed. It was warmer and calmer there. The wind skimmed over the top, but barely stirred the hollow itself. Grasses at the edges grew a little taller, protected by the curve of stones around them. Low against one rock face, several silver-leaved shrubs clustered, their thick matte leaves holding a muted glow where the morning touched them. The wanderer paused at the mouth of this hollow. Here he saw several stone markers, a bit more numerous than elsewhere along the path. They didn't form a solid wall, but they gathered in a crescent shape, partially encircling a smooth depression in the ground. Soft layers of ash had settled around their bases. Lichen crusted their outer sides, while their inner sides, facing the hollow's center, looked clearer, as though wind, mist, or perhaps caring hands had kept them clean. In the center of the depression rested a small pool of water. Not a lot, just a shallow basin created by rain and mist, held among stones that weather had smoothed over time. The surface lay perfectly still. It reflected the pale sky, the upper curve of the observatory's dome, and a dark sliver of the crater rim beyond. Sheltered as this hollow was, the wind did not disturb the water. The reflection lay so quietly that the pool seemed less like water and more like a second sky, placed gently on the earth's surface. The wanderer stepped closer, mindful of each footstep, not because there was any danger, but because the calm of this spot invited a gentle tread. The ground around the basin was damp in places, darkened by warmth from below and moisture from above. A thick cushion of moss grew along one edge of the water, its green so deep it looked almost blue in the shadows. Tiny lichens dotted the stones around the basin like pale stars scattered on rock. A few slender blades of grass leaned over the pool and found their likeness in the reflected sky below. He knelt beside the basin, drawn into a quiet attentiveness. The water smelled fresh and clean, with a faint mineral softness. Around its rim, ash had settled in a fine ring, perhaps marking how the water level rose and fell with cycles of mist and dryness. The basin itself was partly natural, but not entirely untouched. Some stones had clearly been repositioned to deepen the hollow shelter. Others angled to guide water into it. Like the observatory, it didn't impose a shape on the mountain. It accepted what shape the mountain offered and made it more receptive. The wanderer gazed into the reflection. The observatory appeared upside down in the water, copper ribs bending inward, glass panes pale with morning. Beyond that image, the sky stretched wider than the small surface of the pool should permit. A thin cloud drifted overhead and slid silently across the reflected sky like a slow white veil. Along one edge of the mirrored scene, the crater's rim arced across, dark and steady, like the brim of a great bowl. A bowl receiving light. The phrase surfaced softly in his mind, bringing a gentle warmth. He remembered the small symbol, a shallow curve beneath a single point. Inside the observatory, it had felt like a horizon and a star. Here by the water, it seemed to echo this basin, this sheltered curve of earth holding a piece of the sky. He leaned forward a bit, careful not to disturb the water's stillness. At first, he noticed nothing beyond the obvious. Water, reflection, ash, and stone. Then, at the far edge of the pool, half hidden beneath a fringe of moss, something caught a glimmer of light, softer than the shine of any rock. It wasn't bright or large. Anyone moving with haste or a less observant eye might easily overlook it. He waited patiently until a passing cloud slid out of the reflection. The faint glow remained. Gently, he reached toward the moss and brushed aside a few delicate strands. Tucked beneath them, set in a small flat stone at the water's edge, lay a thin piece of copper, dark with age and smoothed by the elements. It had been fitted so seamlessly that it seemed part of the rock rather than an object placed on it. On its surface, worn but still discernible, was that same small mark he had found inside the observatory, a shallow curve beneath a single point. The wanderer didn't speak. He had no need to. The quiet around him deepened, not with awe, but with recognition. The outer path, the scattered stones, the basin, and the symbol hidden in the observatory's copper seam were not separate discoveries at all. They belonged together somehow, pieces of one patient design. He held his fingertips near the little copper piece without touching it directly. Unlike the warm copper in the observatory seam, this one felt cool in the morning shade. Yet as he hovered his hand above it, he sensed a trace of warmth rising invisibly through the stone it rested in. The basin gathered sky, the ground offered heat, and at the rim between them, the copper joined the two. He sat back slowly on his heels, letting that realization remain open and unfinished. Morning continued to brighten around him. Sunlight slid down the outside of the observatory wall, lighting up the copper ribs, then the glass, then the dark stone base. In the basin's mirror, the observatory trembled slightly, yet remained clear, the water barely rippling at all. A faint current of warmth from within the earth flowed through the hollow, only visible in the slightest blurring of mist near the ground. The grasses at the rim of the hollow swayed gently, and their reflections swayed with them. The wanderer understood this was not a final answer, but another beginning. The pattern had widened. What last night seemed to be just a hidden mark inside a building had now revealed itself as part of a larger circle. There was an inner arc of starlight and an outer arc of stones. There was a copper symbol in the glass-walled room and another here by a basin that held the sky. Beneath both was warmth, around both was silence, and supporting everything was the steady mountain, quietly present without explanation. This quiet knowledge carried a touch more tension than before, but of the safe kind, a feeling of anticipation rather than worry. It was as though he had opened the first page of a book with no words, a book composed of reflections, placements, weather, and care. But he would not rush to read it. The mountain did not hurry. The observatory did not hurry. Even the water held the sky without any grasping. He rose slowly to his feet. Before leaving the hollow, he cast one more look into the basin. In its reflection, the observatory remained upside down beneath the earth, as if another quiet sanctuary lay below, made not of stone and copper, but of light and stillness. At the edge of that reflection, the small copper mark waited under its mossy cover, neither announcing itself loudly nor hiding away completely. From somewhere across the crater rim came a soft bird call, distant and brief. The wanderer turned toward the sound, but it soon faded into the open air. The hare was nowhere in sight now. The grasses continued their patient swaying. The sky had grown clear, and the last traces of night had fully withdrawn from the observatory's glass. He began walking back along the gentle curve marked by the stones. Returning this way didn't feel like retracing steps. It felt like seeing the same path with a calmer understanding. The stones seemed less accidental now, more like quiet companions. Each held its place between the observatory and the crater, between shelter and edge, between the human wish to understand and the older patience of the ground. The wanderer passed each marker slowly, letting his gaze rest softly on everyone, not counting them, not fixing their order too strictly in his mind. The observatory gradually grew larger as he came closer. Its glass panels now held the fullness of morning light rather than starlight. Its copper ribs glowed with muted warmth, especially where touched by the sun. Thin trails of moisture trickled down a few panes. A light dusting of ash still lay along the ledges. The doorway waited in shadow, familiar now, and the stone wall beside it felt even steadier than before. as though what he'd found outside made the shelter within more meaningful. At the threshold, the wanderer paused. He glanced back toward the hollow, though the basin itself was hidden from view at this angle. The curved path slipped out of sight behind a shoulder of rock. The stone markers blended into the terrain again, nearly invisible unless one knew how to look for them gently. This made him smile. The place wasn't exactly hiding from him. It was simply keeping its own deliberate pace. He stepped back into the observatory. Inside, the air was warmer and stiller than outside. The familiar scent of copper and stone filled the space. The floor's dark slabs held the memory of the night's coolness. The glass, now bright with day, no longer offered its arc of reflections. But he remembered where it had gathered, where it had curved, where it had come to rest on the copper seam. He walked to that seam. In the daylight, the symbol was visible even without starlight, though it seemed quieter and less alive than it had in the dark. Now it was simply an etched mark in the weathered metal, a shallow curve beneath a single point. Its modesty made him smile. Some things become more powerful by refusing to become grand. He touched the small mark gently once. The copper was still warm. Then he looked across the room. In the daylight hush, the observatory felt quiet in a new way. It seemed to be waiting not for him to unravel its secrets, but simply waiting for the sky to return, waiting for the next part of its slow conversation with the stars. The arc of reflected starlight wouldn't appear now in the sunlit morning. The stones outside had shown their circle. The basin had given its reflection. But something still lay between these clues, something that neither morning nor night by itself could reveal. The wanderer's eyes lifted to the dome above. Suspended high over the central floor, he noticed an instrument he had barely registered before. A lens in a simple copper frame, hanging from a curved arm that could be turned toward different parts of the glass ceiling. In the dark of night, it had been just another shadow among shadows. In the morning light, it caught a glint along its rim, clear and patient. He stood beneath the lens without touching it. A thin shaft of light passed through the glass and lens, falling softly on the stone floor as a pale, incomplete circle. Yet it pointed, with delicate certainty, toward the spot along the wall where the arc of light had ended the night before. The wanderer inhaled slowly. Outside, the marked stones circled the crater's rim. In the hollow, the basin held a piece of sky. Inside, the symbol rested in copper, and above him, the lens gathered a faint thread of morning light. He didn't yet know what that lens might gather when the stars returned at night. That question, quiet and luminous, stayed with him as morning fully settled around the observatory. It did nothing to disturb the calm of the place. It only opened his sense of it a little further, like a door resting gently on its latch, waiting for evening, waiting for darkness, waiting for the next patient alignment of earth, glass, copper, water, and sky.